I, when it's part of the writing game, you put your book out, you write a screenplay and movies made, you're going to be subject to criticism. In the old days, it was a few reviewers and professional critics. Now, everybody who owns a computer, whether they own a brain or not, can weigh in with their opinions. And, you get to read all these things on Amazon or whatever. And sometimes they make good points. I mean, I read sometimes reviews that point out something in my books where I made a mistake, or maybe I should have thought about something, and, okay, I'll think about that more. But there's also criticisms that just annoy the fuck out of you because you reject them. And for me, one of the ones that I hate most is this word gratuitous. I am constantly being accused of gratuitous sex, gratuitous violence, gratuitous feast scenes, gratuitous heraldry, And if you take out everything that these idiots consider gratuitous, you would have the Cliff's Notes version, which is basically a plot summary. And then they fought a battle and this side won. Okay, that's what happens in terms of advancing the plot. But advancing the plot is not what it's all about. It's about immersing you in the world. And, violence and sex and feast scenes and all that are never gratuitous. They're part about making it real, immersing you and feeling you in this, and the details are important. Space race sex is offensive on the face of it, because every sex act is different according to the partners who are in it, and it also affects the relationships of the characters afterwards. Some sex is not so good, I mean, sometimes you laugh and break up, and sometimes somebody can't get it up, and sometimes you dissolve into a fight in the middle of it, and sometimes somebody wants to be punched. And who the fuck knows? But it illuminates the character, and it determines the arc of the characters after that sex scene, and you should give the details. And battle scenes, violence, I've written stories that are, in which no one dies and which there is no violence. That's fine. That's perfectly legitimate. You want to write a story like that? Good. But if you're going to write a story about war and it's going to have battles and sword fights and people with axes in it, don't just make it clean. There's something offensive about clean violence, like the movies I watched in the 50s and TV shows, Gunsmoke. Matt Dillon draws his gun and shoots. The bad guy falls down, No, how about the head splattering and the bloods and brains going everywhere? That's what it's really like. If you're going to talk about guns and axes and swords, show what they're really like. That's your obligation, I think, as an author. If you don't want to include violence, don't include violence. Don't have fight scenes. Don't write about war. But if you're going to write about that stuff, do it honestly, and that means showing it in all its horror and ugliness and visceral stuff. People with their entrails hanging out, screaming in pain and begging for their mother. That's what medieval battles were all about.
Yeah, and don't think that by escaping the war scene, you escape the gore. Because if you're going to write about, okay, we're not going to have the battle, we're just going to have afterwards, I have news for you about what a battlefield looks like, or what the people look like when they're coming home. I was looking at some World War I photos of soldiers coming home, and we have this romanticized view. Some of those guys are coming home with half a face. And these are the ones living and moving around the world. My response when people always talk about gratuitous sex is, but if you're not having gratuitous sex, what are you having?
Gap sex. Which, demands a certain amount of sympathy. You also, both of you have an interesting detachment from characters that you seem to have no compunction about killing them off.
That's a question for George.
when one might be tempted to hold on to a character that your audience is endeared to, you don't seem to have that impulse. and further yet, there's also, I read a little relish in it when they depart the narrative, and I'm wondering, how is it for you as writers when that moment comes when a character must go? Does that evolve in the telling of the story, or do you have a relationship with your characters in a way where you just know that this person can't last?
Well, I think it depends on the character and the situation. I mean, you know, from very early stage in writing Song of Ice and Fire, I knew that certain characters were going to have to die, and I knew
Sean
more or less
Bean.
when they when they died. Yeah, Ned was. I mean, that's a fairly classic template. It's not like I invented that. It's in some ways it's Frank Herbert's Dune. You know, you get rid of the father because the story is really about the children, and I just extended it a little further and made Ned seem more important and brought him more to life than Frank Herbert did with Leto Atreides, and therefore his death had more impact. One of the things that I hate in you know, we write the books we want to read, and what kind of books do I not want to read? Well, I do not want to read books that are utterly predictable, and I get a lot of them. You know, I get a book sent to me, and I read the first chapter or something, and I know exactly how it's going to go. Here's the hero, here's the villain. The hero's going to get in a lot of trouble at the end, but ultimately he's going to be triumphant. And here's the girlfriend, he's going to get her at the end, and etc. You can see this story just laid out. I don't want my stories to ever be predictable. I want to surprise the reader and affect the reader emotionally. And you know, this question of death is a big thing. In real life, death affects us. I'm sure everybody in this auditorium has had someone die, a parent, both parents, a sibling, some, God help you, a child, which is probably the hardest thing in all, a best friend. I've lost 3 friends in the last year, and every one of the deaths had an impact on me and was gut-wrenching. But in fiction, too often, death is just thrown in as an act break. It doesn't have any emotional resonance. You know, I mean, people say I kill so many people. Star Wars, you know, they blew up the entire planet of Alderaan, and you know, before the credits, practically. Oh, Alderaan is gone. 1 billion voices have ceased. Do you give a shit about any of them? No. It's just, okay, Alderaan is gone, but I don't want to do that kind of death. I want to affect you with the death of a fictional character the same way you'd feel if a friend or a loved one died. I want you to feel that death. I want my books to engage you emotionally. I want you to laugh at the funny parts and get hungry when I describe a feast and get horny when I read a sex scene, or either that or be repelled if it's a ugly sex scene. But engage you emotions. I mean, that to my mind, emotional involvement is what fiction is all about. If you want to make an intellectual argument, essay is a wonderful form. Nonfiction, journalism, they're great things to make an intellectual argument. But fiction is about engaging the emotions.
Yeah, it's. I'm glad you brought up to my other topic, sex and violence. You know, I've always said violence should be violent. You know, and sex should be sexy. And death should have the impact of death. And there are quite a couple of things I thought of. One being, for a lot of fantasy, including my own, a lot of the template is medieval times. In the medieval times, there are tons of death. It's if your family had 3 children, it means 9 died. If you made it to 50, God bless you, because you're not going to make it to 52. So it is such a constant presence in medieval life. What I mean medieval, I mean up to 1950. Chances are your grandmother isn't telling you that, yes, you have 5, you have a grandmother, granduncle, but 6 of us died before 1942. So it's something that is so ever present, but I think it's one of these things we feel is a contract, and I'm not knocking film, but film has played a large role in this unwritten contract we seem to have that nobody should die. Tom Cruise is in the film, so clearly he's going to make it to the end.
Whether he should or not.
You know, it's one of the reasons why I was just in the Psycho theme bathroom, and I remember when Psycho came out, Psycho horrified viewers, because like, hold on, you're killing the main character in the middle of the show? What do we do now?
Yep.
But,
huge influence, huge impact.
Yeah, Hitchcock forever, and particularly Psycho, because sometimes death doesn't always happen like that, but it does. And I think that it should resonate. I remember one of the questions or criticism I tend to get a lot is that my stories are drenched in violence, they're violence heavy, and I always said no, they're not. I said there's a difference between preponderance and resonance. There are far more men died, far more men and women died in every action flick than in my story. I mean, at the end of a Schwarzenegger movie, chances are 70 people were killed, if not more. Or Alderaan blew up, so 50 million people were killed. But it's none of. But if one scene of death, one scene of violence that has suffering, for example, that's the thing. There's lots of violence, but there's no suffering. There's lots of death, but there's no grief. Is even in the ways in which you write sex. Like, sex, there's a lot of what I call space break sex.
Please define that.
So space break sex would be, and he said, come to me now, space break. The next morning, they woke up and I was like, but there's certain things that happen there. And the idea that sex itself is something that's loaded with emotional resonance is ridiculous.
There were nights in my 20s, though, I think that there was space break sex.
Yeah.
But I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, but I think these are essential parts of human experience, but they're also very raw and disturbing, and we take time to process them. But I think but what better place to do that than a book? Because you can sit with a story, you can sit with a chapter. I'm now sitting with a scene where Rochester is threatening Jane Eyre with violence, and she's going, I couldn't have loved him more. I'm like, girl. So but that's another thing. You're supposed to lose sleep over a book. You're supposed to get sweat a little bit. You should fret over characters and their decisions, particularly when you know they're about to make a bad decision. And because again, literature is life, and it should also flow that way.